Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Come on in. That's it. Use up the seats at the back. Use up the seats at the front first. Take a seat. Sit down. Get your whiskeys ready. We're here for another live whiskey me tasting. Today we are tasting this month's world whiskey, which is Sonoma Distilling Company's Cherrywood Rye. Super happy to have Adam Spiegel on the line, the founder of Sonoma Distilling Company. I'm going to introduce him shortly. Before I do, just a reminder or a request even to, if you like, review us on Facebook. Just drop us a little review with some comments. It could be a good review, it could be a bad review. Hopefully it's a good one. But we'd love to hear from you. And obviously that's a pretty easy thing to do. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest for this evening, all the way from California. It's Adam Spiegel. Hey, Adam.
Hi there. How are you?
Good to see you, and good to have you on the tasting. I think this is the furthest afield we've ever gone from the United Kingdom with a whiskey and with a live tasting. I don't think we've ever been further than the West Coast of America.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you. I mean, and for me, it's easy. It's like noon. So it's the middle of the day for me. So, I mean, you got to make me drink whiskey. I guess that's tough, but I'll do it.
Yeah. Well, it's 8 p.m. here, which is definitely whiskey drinking time. Although, I mean, you're sat in a distillery at noon, so I guess it's whiskey drinking time there as well, right?
Yeah. You know, the Zoom backgrounds, everyone supposes I have like a fake background behind me, but I actually do make whiskey in a real world.
Those are real barrels. Yeah. Cool. Well, look, it would be great to get a bit of backstory around the Sonoma Distilling Company. We share with our members a bit of information in the emails we send out and our social media, and we even do a blog post that sort of outlines some of the backstory, but there's nothing that matches it straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So maybe you want to give us a little bit of a potted history of yourself and of the distillery.
Totally. Nay. So my backstory is it seems like it's a bit more of a common one in the U.S. You know, sort of found myself at a turning point in my life and didn't really know what I wanted to do. You know, I lost my job, a lot of other people in 2008 during the financial crisis. And I realized very quickly that I didn't really have any sort of tangible skills, anything I can go and like transfer into something else. Now I was just a salesperson in the financial world. And so I started making beer, right? Because what do you do when you have loads of time and a little bit depressed and looking to learn how to make something with your hands, right? So I started making beer, and beer kind of quickly turned into wine. And then obviously when you're done making wine, you've got leftover pumice, grape skins and twigs and berries. And so I started making grappa very quickly. I bought a little hobby still off of eBay. They shipped as a garden ornament. And I received that still. And then all whiskey starts as beer. So I started actually making whiskey because I had leftover beers that had either gone right or gone wrong. And so I started sort of learning how to sort of cut the still nicely. And for those who've been sort of following my story, I co-founded a distillery in 2010 called 1512 Spirits, was our original company name. So we've been overseas with that name. So there's probably some old bottles floating around in the ether. But then I bought my old business partner out in 2013. So I've been running the Sonoma Distilling Company basically since then. And it's been really fun to grow this brand from this little tiny distillery, which was, 800 square feet, which probably doesn't help very much in terms of your spacing, but it's very small. And then we've now grown. We're 21,000 square feet with probably another 20,000 plus coming on board soon. So we are feeling really good about where we're at and where we're going. And I'm stoked to sort of take a lot of the lessons I learned in the early days. We still use the alembic stills, which are just much larger versions of the traditional pot stills that I've always used. And so I just feel like I can kind of, see where I've been and where I'm going. And it seems like a very clear path to me about the type of whiskey I want to make and continue to grow that from here.
Talk to me a little bit about Sonoma, like the county, the wine country, because it's an interesting place to locate a whiskey distillery. Were you ever tempted to do like brandy or like eau de vie?
Yeah, and I think the answer is yes and yes, and I probably will. Yes, I mean we have some brandy and barrel that we have not yet released. I have a bunch of stuff that I've been, obviously messing with for years. If there was a market for grappa, I'd probably be making that too. I mean, I
Yeah.
love clear spirits. I have appreciation for drinking other people's clear spirits, especially things like vodkas and gins and stuff they make from scratch. And then, I also enjoy, sort of looking at my county and sort of getting inspired by what we do. So those who know Sonoma County really well, they know beer and wine, food, right? There's an amazing food culture here. And we've sort of been on the forefront, the cutting edge of a lot of this stuff really happening, in not just California, but other parts of the US where, we are sort of just taking, they call it sort of the California cuisine. They take all these ideas from different cultures and they mesh them together really, really well here in California. And obviously, we're blessed to be here. We're blessed to be around those things. We're also, we got amazing climate. It's hot and cold and hot and cold all the time. I showed up this morning and it was, I had to have a sweatshirt on, and by the middle of the day, I'm taking my sweatshirt off and it's hot and I'm wishing I would have worn shorts. And then towards the afternoon, I got to put my sweatshirt back on. It's just that does amazing things for whiskey, does amazing things for fermentations. It does amazing things for a lot of stuff. And so I'm really stoked to be able to just sort of celebrate this region.
Must have good access to wine casks as well, right?
Yeah, and we've really just begun the process of sort of looking at wine cask maturation, either as a primary maturation vessel or as a secondary a secondary vessel. Honestly, I think that's an area that I think the bourbon world, if you're thinking about just one of the type of whiskey that we make, the bourbon world has already seen some exploration into. There's sort of a lot of feelings both for and against doing that. I think sometimes whiskey drinkers want to drink whiskey and sometimes wine drinkers want to drink wine. And sometimes those things should meet and sometimes they shouldn't. So I'm having a interesting sort of, quandary figuring out where we sit on those items. I do think particularly that's where I'm going to be able to celebrate the idea of blends more. And so I've begun to start formulating blends that have different barrel maturations and different finishes, which will give me an opportunity to make unique blends that might be regionally specific or something to have a particular flavor profile to them. So yeah, we're blessed to have them. It's just, I don't necessarily know what to do with them yet. So I'm still kind of figuring that out.
Yeah, it's a bit of a dilemma, isn't it, with American whiskey at the moment? Like how, because what I understand from your operation is you're quite sort of traditional in the approach. It's very much handcrafted and authentic. And, so there's an argument, like, should you be introducing wine casks into that mix? Because that takes it off on a different tangent. It might be a delicious tangent, but does it kind of fit with the identity of the brand or the vision,
And as people are buying bottles off the shelf, both, everywhere, domestically as well as internationally, there's no scratch and sniff, right? That's not like I can go in there and sort of scratch the bottle and like get a sense for what this thing is going to taste like or smell like. And so, that's a problem, right? Because then, if I do some exploration that someone was not expecting, I want them to grab a bottle off the shelf, be able to open it up and drink it and sort of have at least some sort of preconceived notion of what it is they're going to be trying or drinking. Yeah. Unless they're joining in the sort of communal experimental part of it, which is totally fine, but they should just know they're walking through one door versus walking through another. And so I'm definitely excited about that. I mean, I think the cool part here, right, is that we've been open for 11 years. I've been distilling technically for 13. I know we've got a long history ahead of us. I'm a young guy. I've been doing this now for a long time. We were the 15th distillery in the state. There's now 150 distilleries in California. Within the first 200 in the United States. Now there's 2,000 in the United States and growing by the day. I mean, it feels like we're just at the very, very beginning of this story. And I'm excited to see, we check back in 5 years or 10 years, like what I'm up to then, what I look like then, nonetheless. But, it'd be really interesting to see how it all goes. And I'm excited for that journey.
What's your prognosis sort of for the American whiskey industry or craft distilling industry in America at large over the next 5 to 10 years? Do you see it getting bigger? I mean, do you think that the growth or the growth in number of distilleries is sustainable? How do you see it going?
No, I think it's certainly sustainable. I mean, I would never fault somebody else today or yesterday or tomorrow trying to get into this industry, because I got in when I got in. That doesn't mean that because I got on the bus at different time than somebody else that I have more of a priority than anybody else, right? I think there's a lot of room to grow. If we're talking about just whiskey in particular, drinking trends in the U.S., we are not even drinking close to where the U.S. was drinking in the 1970s in their whiskey consumption. So from all whiskey distilleries, and that's including the big guys who pump out millions of gallons a year, or little guys like me who pump out less than 100,000 gallons a year, we are all sort of looking around being like, cool, that means there's a much taller ceiling that we haven't even touched yet. So let's just keep on making our stuff and growing and educating, and we'll go from there. There's a ton of room for innovation. And there's a ton of room for people to stay local. Like I happened to go overseas in 2012. We've been for sale in the UK and parts of Europe since 2012, both through East London Liquor Company in the UK. And then La Maison de Whisky does a lot of the work outside of the UK. And, I went out there early because I had to. I wasn't even allowed legally to sell in the United States directly until a couple of years ago. And so I've always had a challenge about not being able to sell out my back door, right? I could sell through distribution. So
this is due to like local laws.
Local laws, local old prohibition-era laws that just haven't been changed yet. And so I have always had an international focus. And I've always thought the Sonoma name sort of carries with it a lot of panache and, mystique and history and quality and all that sort of stuff. So, so long way of saying I think there's a lot of room to grow. I think there's a lot of room for innovation. The one thing I heard over the last year that has stuck with me that I would like to repeat, that I heard from Lance Winters over at St. George, who another person I respect the hell out of, was, just because you make something local doesn't mean that it's good. And you got to make something good because the consumers are expecting something good. And we're not just going to sell something and have it, the very first thing you sell be, you should buy this because it's local. No, you should buy this because it's good. And so if there are 4,000 distilleries in 5 years from now, and there's 10,000 distilleries, and as long as we're all making good things and we're trying to make something that's unique and different and sort of has our own signature to it, like we should be able to do it all. But, the second that we lose that innovation, the second that we lose that interest and that craft and that enthusiasm, the consumers will tell it because they're going to stop buying it. And then ultimately, I think we as a business are going to have a much harder time. So I think we focused ourselves really carefully over the last 11 years to make good whiskey, not just local whiskey. Ideally using local ingredients because I want to support local farmers and sort of celebrate California. But I think we just need to focus long term on this. What is the long game here? The long game for me is focusing on making whiskey that is good and is drinkable and is pliable, and you can put it in cocktails or drink it neat and do all sorts of cool stuff with it, and constantly trying to raise my own expectations for where I previously set a previous batch and what I need to do to improve it every single time. Meet or exceed the quality has always been the goal.
Yeah, I think sometimes the notion of making a good product gets lost in the whole conversation around sustainability. Like, if you want it to be sustainable, it has to be good first and foremost. And like we see it here in the UK, not so much of whiskey yet, because outside of Scotland, in England, there's only really still a handful of whiskey distilleries popping up. I'm sure there will be more, but certainly with gin distilleries, there are, you're never more than 5 miles from a gin distillery now. And in my opinion, there's some great ones, don't get me wrong. There's great ones who've taken the opportunity to innovate quicker or better than the big brands can do. There's ones who have taken a more traditional approach than the big brands have these days. And some of them are making really good gin. But there's also ones that are purely relying on the local story and the local market. And you wonder how much legs there are in those brands, after 5-10 years when, they're still kind of turning up to the farmers markets and flogging a few bottles and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's gonna be tough, and especially because that gin market, not just where you're at, but just worldwide, is certainly a saturated place.
Yeah.
A lot of noise, and you can realistically either make a neutral grain spirit from scratch or neutral grape or whatever your base is, and then infuse it with a bunch of local herbs and botanicals, and make yourself something really, really unique, right? But the problem is, I think that ecosystem is going to be small, right? There's going to continue to be price, constraints, and where people are going to sort of feel the pinch to try and constantly like lower their prices to compete with somebody else, to compete with the volume that they can never produce. And it's just going to be a really tough game for a lot of people to do that with. I think that the innovative side is important. I think the local side is important, and I don't want to discount those things. I mean, we tout the fact that the cherrywood trees that I use to smoke the barley that goes into the cherrywood rye come from California, and they come from about 60 miles away from the distillery. That's important because I have a smoker in the back of the house that we smoke our whiskey with. So I love that, right? And I think it's important that we are constantly sort of asking the question, like, what can we do to tell that story if that's important for that product? But ultimately, as we go to scale things up, I mean, the drought has been a really interesting sort of. So we're in California, we're in a huge drought right now.
Yeah.
A lot of the rye that was grown in California actually didn't make it this year. So we've had to pivot this year, and I'm not sure this is going to be a forever thing or just a today thing, but like it sometimes doesn't make sense to source grains from places where grains shouldn't grow, right? These are the questions that we are actually asking ourselves as both Californians as well as Americans right now. It's like, if it grows better in colder environments, and we've got plenty of land all over the United States that grows in really cold environments, let's just source it from there. Let's find the best ingredients, and
don't try and force the issue, kind of thing.
And we've done both, right? Like I've sourced good ingredients to begin my company, and went out to market and created this thing. And then I spent the last 2 or 3 years pushing really hard to have it be California, 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 California. And then this drought hit and sort of punched us in the face. And now we're like, oh my God, what do we do now? Right? We don't have rye. So have to change my brand or change my ethos. Like, no, I think the ethos has always been use good ingredients, be able to create a grain to glass spirit, something from scratch for the Sonoma brand. That's really important. And, that is Californian, and that is craft. And so I feel like I'm checking all the boxes that feel authentic to the process. Yeah. And so therefore the product is still good and, real, and, I haven't changed anything. And ultimately the consumer is not going to be able to taste the difference between a rye that was grown in California versus a raw rye that was grown in Colorado or Minnesota or Missouri. There's subtle differences, but on a macro scale, macro scale, as I'm making a blend of 3,000-4,000 gallons, those little flavors get lost. They get sort of diluted over time.
I just think there's an argument for it in beer, like the terroir thing or varietal of cereal or whatever, because there's only really one stage to that process. Well, you sort of mill it and ferment it, condition it. But when you start adding in distillation and casks, there's so many other elements to that with what yeast strain you're using, the temperatures involved. It's really going to kind of mitigate any of the nuance that you originally had in the cereal, probably.
It does. And also the thing that I also look at too, so people have asked the question, like, do you use organic grains? And we use non-GMO for the majority of our grains. Even if I'm getting from out of state or what have you, it's all non-GMO corn and barley and, and rye and wheat. But like the thing that's interesting is that if I were to make a product from 100% malted rye that's organic and 100% malted rye that is non-GMO, you would never be able to taste the difference, period. Like there's no, they potentially would be different grain sources. So there might be some subtle differences between the different varietals of rye, just to be, talking about this in a vacuum. But I do think it's really interesting that, if you can pay into a system that you believe in, this is a lot like I do in my personal life. Like I go to farmers markets because I want to support farmers. So I eat the food that's grown that's going to go bad in my fridge in 5 days because I don't want food that has a ton of preservatives, and I want to support local farmers, right? So as I go to make my whiskey, I want to do the same thing, right? I want to support as many local farmers as I can. I want to pay into a system that supports either organic or non-GMO grains. But so far we don't put on the label because not all the grains are organic, or not all the grains can come from local sources. So these are the challenges that we're dealing with. A lot of other brands are dealing with. Some brands just don't really care. If you're a big guy, like you're just getting train loads of grain in every single week, and you don't really care about those sources, and that's totally fine too. There's a whole bunch of different ways to skin that cat.
Right. So speaking of grains, let's talk about this whiskey, the cherry. So initially, when I heard of this whiskey, I don't know when, I was like, "Oh, it's aged in cherry barrels. That's interesting." And that must be a confusion that happens sometimes, right?
Happens a lot.
Yeah.
Happens a lot. Yeah. We're addressing that. So as of next year, probably, I don't know where it's going to hit the UK, probably middle of next year, we are updating our packaging again. We've gone through a bunch of iterations. There's, these labels existed at one point in network, and then these labels have existed in network. And then we're going to update it again. And some of that has to do with us just sort of evolving as a brand. And some of that has to do with the fact that there's just some questions that seem to continue to be unanswered, that people are always sort of wondering, like, why do you call it Cherrywood Rye? The reason I left the word smoke out had everything to do with the fact that it's not overtly smoky as a flavor profile. The goal is not to be like, a Lafroig or a Lagavulin or anything that's smoky where you really can identify that smoky flavor. I'm trying to give you something that has that smoke sort of mid palate. That's like it's sort of like, oh crap, there's a maraschino cherry in my glass.
Yeah.
This is like something that tastes, pervasively smoky. And that's the reason why. And I understand that it's been a little confusing. And this is what happens when you have a small brand who has ultimate control over their packaging, that they do things a particular way.
Well, trust me, these have gone through a few changes as well over the years.
I respect that. I love those pouches, by the way. I don't know how I can get some of those domestically, because those are cool. I think those are a cool prospect that from a shipping and receiving potential there. I think there could be some really good. But anyway, for another day. But
yeah, sure. No, we'll have another conversation about how we're going to enter the US market and how you're going to help us do that.
Good. We should talk about importing, because we're actually going to start doing some of that work ourselves. So we're happy to help.
Cool. So it's smoked. So the malt component of the mash bill is smoked with cherrywood chips. That's correct. Yeah.
So I actually brought some. I wish we had smell-o-vision here, but basically what we do is we take the malted barley, which actually sometimes gets malted in a malt house behind the building. We have a malt house in the back of our building here. But we also source there's a malt house across town, across the bay, called Admiral. And Admiral does a lot of local malting for a bunch of distilleries, and they're slightly larger than the malt house we have behind us. And so we take freshly malted grains, fully malted, could go into a beer or a whiskey at any second. We lay it in the bed of an old shipping container, and we cold smoke it for about a solid 40 to 45 hours. So this happens over the course of a day. And what's nice about this is, as we cold smoke it, we don't burn the grains. So one of the things you'd be able to see, if you could actually see my hands really, really well, is that none of these grains have any sort of Maillard reaction. They have no real burn on them, because our goal is not to singe the grains or ruin any of the enzymic power of the malted barley. The goal is just to get that smoky flavor in there. And in the early years, of course, we tried steeping it again and making it wet, which we thought we needed to do, which we didn't need to do. Yeah. And this process has been refined over the last 6 years for us. But that's the third grain in this Cherrywood rye. So it's 80% rye, 10% wheat, 10% Cherrywood smoked barley. And, the real history behind this one, and I tell the story enough that people probably think it's full of crap, but the real story is, like, I opened a barrel of Sonoma rye once and it smelled like cherry soda. And I'm like, how can I make this into a whiskey? And so if you think about a cherry soda, you think of like root beer, sarsaparilla spice. So that's rye. You think of like vanilla froth and that sort of strong English toffee vanillin flavor. That's wheat. And then Cherrywood smoked barley, which we're already using for another product, which we make a bourbon. It's another product. I saw a question here. Is this a bourbon? No, it's a rye whiskey. We do a Cherrywood smoked bourbon as well, which is smokier, and corn doesn't hide the smokiness as much. It doesn't integrate as well. It allows the smoke to be a bit more pervasive in the flavor. But the Cherrywood rye is a rye whiskey because it's 80% rye. It's all grain based, new char American oak barrels. And I just think it's really interesting to see what happens when you take a mash bill of 10% malted barley or less that uses that smoke. That smokiness tends to be a bit more like a, rum estery, like softer flavor modifier, and it was a mixologist out there or a bartender out there, think about like just using a modifier. It just sort of just takes the flavor and sort of turns it, which is really exciting.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it totally makes sense to use cherrywood in a rye, if you ask me, because cherry pops up quite frequently in my tasting notes for rye whiskeys. There's something about that cereal that just, produces that kind of rich Morello cherry characteristic. Well, it can come in many forms. In fact, we've got a tasting note here from one of the members here. Actually, I don't know. That might translate very well. Hubba Bubba Bubblegum. Is that a brand you get in the US?
I feel like I've heard that name before. Maybe because someone else gave me that taste. No, maybe because it's a name that you just don't forget. But no, I don't currently have that one in my back pocket. But I do understand what they're talking about. I get it.
Yeah, I mean, Hubba Bubba is like the de facto bubblegum of most British people's childhood, and therefore quite nostalgic, and comes up in tasting notes quite frequently as well. Cool. It's definitely a positive thing.
Well, it's great. I appreciate them saying that, and I love it. Yeah, I see that cherry, vanilla, and pine on the nose as well. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, again, these are the flavors that I was targeting. So it's like one of those things where, as a sort of a proud father, you sort of sit back and you taste something that has evolved over the last 6 years, and it tastes like the thing you wanted it to taste like. Yeah, that's a really unique thing to happen. This product just sort of does that. And I hate to see the word first, right? Because people who always claim they're the first to do things are usually full of crap. But like, I look at the smoked rye whiskey category, and I have not seen other smoked rye whiskeys yet. I'm sure they exist. I look forward to trying all of them. But this was a fairly new idea for us because we were already doing a smoked bourbon. To make a smoked rye made a lot of sense to me. If you think about classic cocktails too, you're thinking about sweet vermouth and maraschino and sometimes sherry or port, right? So you're bringing in a lot of these sort of cherry flavors, these really sweet cherry flavors, viscosity and flavor.
Yeah, you're moving like down the Manhattan old-fashioned kind of route with it for sure.
Totally. And that's what I was targeting too. I mean, it's again, it's one of those things. And then someone mentioned, I saw before, love the color. Like that color is just natural. We don't add colorings, flavorings to it. The reddish hue you see comes from the smoked grains. Like there's no other way to talk about it. Like our two smoked whiskeys have a reddish hue. Our two non-smoked whiskeys have no indication of red. So, the smoke congeners and esters must come through after. Yeah.
It's like that pink ring you get on the outside of a piece of barbecue meat, right? That's been smoked. Maybe it's sort of imparting that same kind of thing. By the way, there is another smoked rye that I know of. Copper Fox Distillery in Virginia do a sassafras rye. So that I think probably similar thought process to you, like the root beer thing and everything.
Totally, yeah. And we used to buy the grain from, and I love Copper Fox a lot. They are great. I'm not remembering the name of the guy who runs it. It's Rick Wassman.
Yeah, Rick
Wassman was actually, when I first started this business up, he was sort of like a god to me. I don't know if anybody else knows who Rick Wassman really is, but
he was really in it early doors, wasn't he? And he was malting
and doing all stuff on his own. Yeah. I met him at a conference once in Kentucky in 2009, and he's walking into the building, and he sort of walked in like this mythical creature to me. I sort of walked in, I was like, "Oh my God, are you Rick Wassman?" He's like, "Yeah." He's wearing flip flops, and he's just like, it was a very funny moment now in hindsight. But
he's a cool guy. I was lucky enough to visit that distillery and have a tour around with
him. Good. Yeah. So I know
sense of humor. He's very funny.
And I know he's using, I think it's more of a single malt style, because I think he's using malted rye as the predominant grain, the entire grain on there. Yeah. I do know that exists. So that's a good point. I always forget about him. But generally speaking, a smoked rye was unique, different. Again, people have put cherry flavoring into rye whiskey and put it in a bottle and sold it throughout the US too. But I just feel like, why do that if you can do it, sort of like making a cocktail with grains. So that's kind of a fun way to do it.
Quick kind of general question here for you as we sort of get close to finishing up. Is this a bourbon?
Yeah, so we can certainly make bourbon in California. Bourbon by law has to be 51% corn. This is, of course, 80% rye, so this makes it a rye whiskey. Goes into a new char American oak barrel. So that differentiation, it just has to do with the different grain blends, grain mixtures. we can make bourbon anywhere in California and throughout the U.S. 51% corn minimum, new char American oak, and then as long as it follows those 3 rules, made in America, you've got a bourbon. So yeah, rye whiskey. I love my ryes. We started making 100% rye out of the gate. That was actually the very first thing we did. When we were starting to cook mashes at home, we wanted to sort of be gluttons for punishment and figure out how to cook rye really, really well.
Yeah, it's difficult grain to use, isn't it?
Very, very sticky, has a tendency to burn really, really easily, especially when you're using direct fired mash tuns before. So there was a lot of trial and error that occurred in the early years.
Did you have direct fired mash tuns, did you?
Yeah, we did for the first 10 years of our existence. I'd say 9 years of our distillery existence and 10 years of my existence unprofessionally, 11 years. We were using direct fired, and that was just a combination of taking a little burner, underneath underneath a stock pot and making a mash slurry, stirring in various rest temperatures and all of those sorts of things. We've now obviously evolved to steam, but we were also using direct fired stills for a long time too. So we were doing direct fired stills until about 2 years ago. So for the first 9 years of our existence, it was all direct fire.
Nice, very traditional approach. So with that in mind, sort of 2 questions really. Are you planning on making a malt whiskey? Or have you made a malt whiskey even? You haven't, as far as I'm aware. And what about making a malt whiskey with that Cherrywood smoked malt?
So yes, we have a malt whiskey in barrel. It's about 5 years old right now, and it's not ready yet. I'm hoping next year I can release it.
Is that in virgin casks, or is that?
I did new char. I did used cask. I've always appreciated the Scotch approach. Well, I guess there's also international whiskeys beyond Scotch now who use barrels to sort of freshly dumped bourbon casks that have softer tannins to them and sort of prime the barrel with some flavor. I like that approach, and so the whiskey is much more Scotch in its its flavor profile and its origin. Of course, made here domestically, made with California 2-row malted barley. So yeah, the answer is yes. We totally have. Look forward to actually getting your taste buds on it next year. Yeah. It's going to taste a lot like a coastal Scotch, so it's like salty, briny. Less tannin driven, more grain driven, which is really exciting.
And that I would say is sorry, just to interrupt. I would say that is a great opportunity as that project progresses years down the line. Then you get your wine casks involved because Scotch loves wine casks, right? It'd be great. Yeah,
you're looking as if you're looking right behind me. Yeah, those are the things. Those are the things I'm definitely messing with. And I've had some really good examples of that too. I mean, Starward from down in Australia, they've been having some great success with some wine casks on there too. I've enjoyed drinking a lot of obviously there's a ton of Scotch producers who've played around with wine casks in different formats, either for primary maturation or for secondary maturation. I mean, growing up in this industry, my favorite whiskey has always been like Glenfarclas. So I've always been like very sherry focused and loving
on the same lines there. Glenfarclas is one of my favorite Scotch whiskies.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say favorites, but you could never. I've never had a bad dram from them yet, and
they're very good value as well. While the prices just go up and up for every other distillery, or at least the high-profile ones, Glenfarclas is still super reasonable prices.
Family owned, I think, helps a lot with that too. They have a little bit more control there. They've also been doing it for a really, really long time. And when I go to Speyside, which I try to do every other year, that tends to be just my happy place. Between them and like Macallan and Aberlour and a bunch of stuff there too. And then smoking in our single malt, not done yet. I totally see it happening. I don't know if it's going to be Cherrywood though. I think Cherrywood blends really well for some of the stronger profiles of rye whiskey or maybe bourbon. You think of like barbecue smoke. I'm thinking a different type of smoke for that. So I've got a couple ideas in my brain already that as soon as I have any available bandwidth, I look forward to actually trying out.
You mentioned Starward. Actually, someone corrected me earlier because the furthest afield distillery that we've done is Starward.
Yes, yeah, totally. Those guys, if you've spoken to those folks, they are great.
They are. And actually, just a little sneak preview for everyone who's watching. We are returning to Starwood, I think before Christmas. We will be featuring one of their whiskeys, so which is cool. One last question for you. Who is the UK distributor?
Yeah, so we're imported by the East London Liquor Company. They sell us throughout the UK. And we are blessed because they are sort of a similar size company to us. So in terms of doing events and sales teams and all sorts of stuff, like we all just sort of have the right, sort of equal, ethos and company size and development. And then I'll be actually coming out there. I'm supposed to come out there unless everything goes crazy again. I'm doing a Whiskey Live Paris. I'll be there in the end of September. And then I'm supposed to duck over to the UK for a night and probably do some events and tastings and stuff too. So I would check out the East London Liquor Company's page. If anything comes up, we'd love to have people there too. And if anybody's going to Whiskey Live Paris, come by and give me a fist bump. I don't know if we'll be wearing masks. I hope so. I imagine so. But I haven't done a trade show. I've been on an airplane in almost 2 years, which is just so weird for me because I would fly religiously every month, and now I've just been home with my kids, which is great, but it's just like, holy crap, I've been on an airplane.
We'll all get sick of airports very quickly again soon. No doubt about it. And by the way, we are so fair. I think there was a question. We currently don't have stock of the Cherrywood rye on our website, but if you want to buy it, you can get it through the East London Liquor Company's website, ELLC. Cool. Look, that was amazing. Thanks so much for coming on and chatting.
No, I'm happy to, and thank you so much for supporting us. And again, as we stay tight on these things, if you have any folks that ever come our way, if you ever find yourself in California, obviously don't be a stranger. Look us up. We're also on at Sonoma Whiskey on Facebook and Instagram. So if you can always consider joining us on that journey, you can see all the new releases, and we do single barrel picks and all sorts of fun stuff too. So
nice.
keep us posted there.
Lovely. Good stuff. Cool. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and